This is a Haag-Streit Slit Lamp, and typically this does not require a lot of maintenance. However, periodically the stage on which the slit lamp moves can become dirty, and moving the joystick can become difficult, and it's possible to lubricate that. The first step typically is cleaning off this plate of the stage. And this can take one or more alcohol pads to clean it off. Now the other thing is to tighten the adjustment screws here. And what you want to do is tilt this forward. Underneath the stage there's a plastic curved end to the joystick, and that also gets dirty, so while you're doing this you can clean this off with an alcohol pad. Now, that can improve the situation just by cleaning off all the dirt. However, it tends to be a little bit hard to move from side to side, even with a clean plate. So typically what's helpful is to put a small amount of lubrication on this plate. Now this is not an eye-drop bottle, this is a 3-in-1 oil. 1 drop covers 1/2 of the plate pretty well. Fingertip, rub it in. And then using a tissue, wipe off the excess. Switch to the far side. 1 more drop to cover the rest of the area. Wipe off the excess. And now it glides back and forth very easily with really no resistance. And this is about all the maintenance that the slit lamp usually requires. Now this is an inexpensive bubble level. I believe it cost me less than $2 a number of years ago. And this is how it should be balanced with the weight of the slit lamp on this table. However, sometimes it's installed incorrectly, or the screws that balance it can loosen over time, and then there's problems where the slit lamp will tend to slide radically in one direction based on the level or non-level of this table. The factors that cause it to be out of level can be adjusting screws, and they're all underneath the table. There are 3 Allen screws, 1 behind this knob, 1 on this side, and another one on the top here. These 3 screws work together to level a collar that goes inside this shaft there's a metal shaft which comes down from the bottom of this bracket through here, and these three screws triangulate against this collar to cause it to be level or not level. Another factor is the table is connected to this bracket with four screws. If these screws are loose, it can be a wobbly tabletop. Or if they're adjusted unevenly, it can be hard to balance. So what I typically do is I look at each screw and sort of count the threads that are visible, and it should be approximately equal on all four screws, and that's the starting point. And then I just use a screwdriver to make sure that these four screws are tight. To level the slit lamp, the first step is typically to unscrew this knob. Now the way this knob works is it actually goes through the collar that surrounds the shaft, and it tightens right up against the shaft which pivots here. So once the knob is removed, you can more easily adjust this screw. Inside of here you can see the central shaft. What's tough to see is the collar on which these three screws tighten, because again the shaft of this knob we just removed goes straight through the collar. There's a hole in the collar that allows it to reach the central shaft, so when you tighten that, it keeps the slit lamp from pivoting. So this is a normal looking slit lamp setup. However, what's happened is the screws that secure it are loose, so you have this very wobbly tabletop, which makes doing a slit lamp exam very difficult. The cause of this is loose screws on the underside of the slit lamp brackets, and so the idea is to get them all tightened, level, and balanced with respect to gravity. So as I'm looking underneath the slit lamp here, what I find is there's loose screws on this bracket. And so what I want to do is to tighten the loose screws so that they're all loosened approximately evenly. Now snug them up so that they're separated by equal amounts. Now all four screws seem to be tightened pretty much evenly. So how did the table look? Well, this bracket is tightened to here, but obviously the set screws that hold the collar in place are not tightened evenly. So a combination of tightening and loosening these three screws while watching the bubble level on the tabletop can then bring it back to proper alignment. So to move this screw, I'm actually pulling on the tabletop so as not to have to lift the whole weight of it. But you could do it by just turning the screws and then periodically check the bubble level on top. And what you can do by analyzing the bubble position is determine which, by trial and error, sort of figure out which screws need to be tightened or loosened. So now we have the bubble back in the center of the level. And the slit lamp table again is solid without wobbling, and so that's the end point of that adjustment. The slit lamp is held in place by brackets on each side. Now these are metal brackets and they slide off fairly easily. I saw a newer model that had plastic brackets that were very tight fitting, very tough to get off. Now typically those brackets keep the slit lamp in place on the table. Without those brackets it would start rolling all over the place. And typically these rollers move at the same rate, right and left side. However, if not assembled correctly or screws loosen, problems can happen. On the end of both rollers is a tightening screw, which locks the roller into the shaft. I recently did a slit lamp adjustment for a new slit lamp that had both of these rollers loose underneath the table. The 4 screws that secure this bracket to the tabletop were loose, and the 3 screws that leveled the slit lamp were crooked. So the poor technician had a terrible time with the slit lamp that was rolling forward crooked because the 2 rollers could roll separately from each other. So it was rolling forward at an angle. The tabletop was wobbling. It was just a totally out of control situation. She then recruited Biomedico, who never came to fix the problem, and then I happened to show up a day or so later and was able to get it in complete 100% working order. But it took all those separate adjustments to do the job. So the way these brackets work on this model is there's a bend to these sharp tips, and they slide through a slot underneath the pegs here. If it slides off too easily, you can change the angle of these bends so that it puts more or less pressure on the bracket so it doesn't either slide off too easily or can hardly go on or off. With the knob tightened underneath the slit lamp, it doesn't really pivot in place very easily. And if you loosen the knob, then the whole slit lamp can change angle depending on how you need to approach the patient. So usually you get the patient in position and tighten the knob if you need to have a secure view of what you're looking at. There are conditions whereby the lighting of the slit lamp tends to dim out. Typically when the slit lamp power indicator light is on, you should be able to get light to show up coming from the slit lamp main beam. This is in pretty much of a slit shape, which can be made thinner or wider depending on how it's set. Now, if the indicator light is on but you're not getting a beam, the problem is very often in this cap. This model releases the cap by pressing in these two buttons, and then the housing slides off. And it's possible to inspect the inside of the cap looking at the electrodes that touch the bulb. If the central spot of this electrode is corroded all over in that whole circle, then there's odds are that the light might be shorted out there or arcing. Similar fashion, this lever here touches the base of the bulb, and if either of these are corroded, then they need to be cleaned off to make better contact. This style of slit lamp bulb has a very specific alignment that must be achieved. There's a notch in this frame of the bulb which fits into this notch in the housing. And so if it's just sort of put in there, the bulb will be at an angle and insufficient light will be going through the aperture of the slit lamp system. And even if it's in that notch, it's still possible that it could be off the rim a little bit and the bulb is crooked, and again the light won't go through the slit lamp properly. So it has to be seated down in place properly. The other thing is the bulb contact itself could be corroded, so a matter of scraping, filing, sanding, even rubbing with a pencil, hard pencil eraser can be good enough to get corrosion off the bulb tip or the contacts inside the cap housing. This version of the slit lamp wire is one piece, and there's really nothing that can be disassembled here. A factory-made piece. And so if the short is in the wire here, the whole unit has to be replaced, which then is a matter of figuring out how the wire gets connected, probably someplace in here. So with the wire replaced, fit it over the housing, and there's a place where it aligns, and then it clicks back in place. When a slit lamp is several years old, one of the things that happens is this rubber sleeve starts to expand and get loose, and then it sort of falls off. So there's two approaches to fixing this loose sleeve problem. One is buying a replacement rubber sleeve, which sells for $16 each from Lombard. It's joystick rubber sleeve, and you can look up the part number online, which I have on one of my printed PDFs on the parts list. And then you basically pull off the old one, and then it really takes two hands to slide on the new replacement. and you sort of wiggle it in place, and then it's tight enough that it stays in place in this position. And that's the quick way to do it. The other way I've done for dozens of Phoroptors is, instead of spending $16 on each sleeve, is to reglue it with epoxy glue. And that ends up being a lot more work, and I'm not really sure that it's a better method, but I've done it so many times that I should point it out. So epoxy glue comes in two tubes, a resin and a hardener, and I basically put an equal amount on a piece of plastic and whip it up together with a chopstick, and then apply the, with this sleeve off, I apply it to the metal shaft of the joystick, and then I slide the sleeve in place, and then I take a bunch of rubber bands and I wrap it around the assembled joystick lever here, and then give it about 15 minutes for the epoxy glue to set, and then remove the rubber bands and then wipe off the excess with with alcohol pads, and then it holds usually for a few years that way, but eventually the rubber will stretch out again, and then I either have to reglue it, or if it's stretched so much, then I get a new joystick rubber. That's the easiest way to handle it, I think, is to get a new rubber sleeve and just put it on over the joystick.
Thank you.
Some other slit lamp related problems is with the supporting arm itself. This should pivot pretty easily here. It should be possible to move this off to the side as well. However, over a series of years of use, these pivots can tighten up, typically due to dried out grease. And there are ways to lubricate the situation. In this bottom portion of the slit lamp arm, there's actually bearings inside of here, which are very difficult to visualize and get to. I have on occasions removed this knob and sprayed 3-in-1 oil in there and gotten some improvement. But there's a bearing there and a shaft that goes down through the middle. To get at that, it's actually useful to remove the 4 screws that secure this plastic cover. Once the screws are removed, the collar slides off. Now this is another Allen head screw which secures the bottom of the shaft. The shaft goes from here all the way up into here, and the shaft itself can be lubricated, and then you can access the bearings in there. But to do that, it's a good idea to remove some of the weight from this whole slit lamp assembly. Using a 5mm size Allen wrench, it's possible to completely remove the screw there. And you'd think it'd be a real easy matter to just sort of lift up this arm to slide out the shaft, and then you could lubricate the bearings, lubricate the shaft, and put it back together again. And you'd think that'd be easy, but it's incredibly heavy because the slit lamp itself is incredibly heavy. So to lighten the situation, I don't usually remove the table itself. I usually remove the slit lamp from the table, which there's 3 steps. One is removing the power wire from the cap, removing the end brackets here, and then, as light as a slit lamp is gliding on the surface, you'd never guess it's this heavy, but it's massively heavy. So once it's removed, it's then easier to lift up the bracket and shaft to lubricate inside of there. So in this case, I've also removed the tabletop, which I'll now be able to lift up this bracket more readily. So I remove the tabletop by unplugging the power cord, loosening the knob, and then lifting the shaft up through the middle. And now I'll be able to lift up this shaft more easily to lubricate inside. Now, as you see here, there's a bearing exposed as well as the shaft from the bottom of the slit lamp. So the project is complete. Everything's back together again now. These are two other versions of slit lamp caps from the Haag-Streit 900. This one, I believe, is 30 years old or more. This is one electrode, and this circular area contacts the base of the bulb. This is the other electrode, and this surface contacts the rim of the circular rim of the bulb. That was redesigned, probably 25 years ago, and up to probably about maybe 15 years ago to this version where this bar was added, and that keeps the electrode for the base of the bulb from contacting this, which is electrified, related to this electrode that contacts the rim of the bulb. Now, typically when I run into a slit lamp that has a shorting out problem, what I typically find is that the electrode here is charred. Rarely is this electrode tip charred, but this electrode is charred, and then the base of the bulb is charred. And typically this spring is very weak. That is, the bend of it is such that it doesn't contact this bar. So what I then do is I dismantle the cap and change the bend of this electrode so that it's very tight the way it is right here. So that when it goes on top of the slit lamp, you have to actively push it down and then tighten the two nuts that hold it in place on top of the slit lamp housing. Now I'll show you how it dismantles. The first step is to remove these two screws. So these electrodes are held in place by these contacts, which actually are screws, and they go into a nut inside the cap. So this flat plate is actually threaded, which goes into this. This electrode then is typically not bent this radically. It's much more straight across, and it makes a very weak contact. So what I do is I bend it so that it ends up like this angle. Then getting it back in place is a little bit tricky to fit the parts and the fingers and everything inside of here to get it back together again. Then once screwed in place, now there's little holes in the This is actually like an electrode that the electrical connector hooks into. There's actually little holes in here, but I find it's really not that useful. I usually just take a needle nose pliers to grip it and rotate to tighten. I mean, in theory, you could stick a little piece of a paper clip or something in there, but it doesn't have the strength of what a needle nose pliers does. This top electrode can pretty much easily be bent to make a better contact with the bulb base if it's arcing. But this also is a screw that goes into this shaft, and that can be removed. Now, if you put this back together again, you'd be in trouble because the angle of this electrode is such that it actually touches this piece, so that would make a complete circuit and blow your fuse. So you have to make sure you get all the parts back in place. This bar keeps the electrode from contacting the other electrode. So this cap is ventilated. There's an airspace here, and these 3 screws hook into these 3 fittings. And if you remove the screws, then the plate falls out, the electrodes, this bar falls out. So anyway, these have to be kept in place. The other matter is cleaning the electrode. This one is actually fairly shiny. A little bit of pitting, corrosion in the center. A lot of times when a slit lamp is shorting out, you'll find this whole area is blackened with really no shininess to it at all. Scraping or sanding. This is a small remnant of emery paper, and just sort of rubbing it against the area until you get it fairly shiny is one technique. When I've been desperate to get it working and I don't have any emery paper with me, if I'm out doing a repair, I'll just take a optician screwdriver and gently scrape away the corrosion until I've got bare metal, and the same thing with the tip of the bulb. I'll scrape that. If you have a real hard pencil or ink eraser, you can also rub off corrosion that way as well. The tip here, if it's corroded, should also be cleaned as well, but this is far less frequent as a cause of shorting out of a slit lamp bulb assembly.